Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Ecosystem Restoration session. We'll just have a short introduction. We'll have first speaker up is Richard Duncan, who's come Kiwi but now in Australia, and he'll tell us all about New Zealand in context, why we have so many threatened species. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Dwayne, and thanks for coming along after lunch. Try and keep you awake. So what I thought I'd do is I moved to Australia about 4 years ago, and moving to another country really gives you an opportunity to step back and have a look at the kind of work that's going on in New Zealand and from a broader perspective. And that's what I wanted to do today. I wanted to sort of take a step back, have a think about New Zealand and how it is that we got to where we are, and in particular why it is that we really lead the world in terms of threat and extinction risk, and why in some sense New Zealand has such a global conservation burden. So that's what I want to talk about today. And so New Zealand is identified as one of the world's 25 global conservation hotspots, and that means that we have a large number of endemic species that are under significant threat. And of course what that means is that if we lose species, then both from a New Zealand perspective that's a lot, but more so from a global perspective, in that we have a disproportionate amount of endemic species whose loss would result in a disproportionate loss in global biodiversity. And so what I'm interested in is why we're in that situation. Why is New Zealand one of the 25 conservation hotspots? And I'm going to focus this talk on birds, in part because we know so much about birds, and so we can really reconstruct what's going on with New Zealand's avifauna and get a bit of a grip on this question. And part of the reason New Zealand is a conservation hotspot is because we're an island that's been long isolated from mainland regions. And we know, for birds at least, that islands are hotspots of threat and extinction. So this is data from the IUCN Red List, from BirdLife International that manages that. You can see that I've just divided it up into mainland and birds that are restricted to islands, and about 12% of the global avifauna is restricted to islands. You can see if we look at threat status, then almost double that proportion of birds on islands are threatened. So there's a disproportionate rate of threat for birds on islands. And if we look at recent extinctions, and I see in BirdLife International, these are extinctions since 1500 AD, so they're extinctions that have occurred in the last 500 years, and 70% of recent bird extinctions have occurred on islands. So part of the reason New Zealand's a conservation hotspot is that we're an island that's been long isolated from mainland regions. We've got highly endemic bird species, and we know that on those situations, bird species are often very vulnerable to threats such as introduced predators. So they're naive, they haven't evolved in the presence of predators, and the introduction of predators can have devastating impacts on island avifaunas. So that's part of the reason why we're a conservation hotspot. Well, it's really not the full story. So here I've taken the data from BirdLife International, and they divide the world up into 242 countries. And so for each of those countries, I've plotted the number of bird species that are present in each country, so each point's a country, against the number of threatened bird species in that country. And the blue line is the sort of trend line that's fit through all of the data. So the more species, the more native bird species that you have, the more threatened bird species you have, and that's not surprising. If you just had a constant proportion of your avifauna that was threatened, you'd expect to see that relationship. What the key thing is, though, is how far you deviate away from this trend line. So anything that's above this blue line has more threatened species than you would expect on the basis of the number of native species that are present in that region. And then the size of the circles here represent the number of recently extinct species. So the bigger the circle, the more recently extinct species that there have been as well. And then in red, I've just plotted islands. So you can see down here that islands pose a large number of the smaller regions of the world that contain a disproportionate number of threatened and recently extinct species. And if you look at where New Zealand sits on this graph, we are the outlier. We sit far above this trend line than any other equivalent areas of the same size or diversity, and certainly above any other islands that are in a similar sort of situation to us. I think Neil Gemmell said yesterday that New Zealand has the gold medal for threat and extinction in birds. I'd say we've got more than the gold medal. We're way ahead of the pack. We're smashed the world record in terms of that. We really are an outlier in this graph. And that's what I want to talk about today, is why are we such an outlier? What's different about New Zealand that means that we have got a large proportion of the world's threatened and recently extinct species, far more than we would expect, on the basis of where we sit, and even far more than we would expect on the basis that we're an isolated island that's got endemic species and that's prone to extinction from predators. So really what I do for the rest of the talk is, first up I want to sort of give you the answer, and then I'd like to run through some evidence that just hopefully kind of outlines where we've come from, and hopefully provide you a bit of evidence to suggest that this might be part of the reason as to why we sit where we do. And the reason really, I think, stems around this idea that the current threats to our avifauna stem mostly from processes that have been initiated since European arrival. So since Europeans' arrival, we've obviously had major habitat loss through agricultural intensification, draining of wetlands, those kinds of things. And coupled with that, we've had introductions of predators. And they are really the major threatening forces in our avifauna over the last few hundred years, and what drive current classifications of threat and recent extinction in New Zealand birds. And these are processes that have only been initiated in the last few hundred years since Europeans got here. Well, the key thing is that prior to European arrival, there was another wave of human colonisation when Maori arrived in New Zealand, and that itself initiated its own extinction event that occurred prior to the one that we're currently experiencing. And the key thing is that the species that European colonisation is impacting are only a subset of the species that were originally here. They've been through an extinction filter that was caused by the first human arrival and the extinction event that accompanied that. And the key point I want to make here is that relative to other islands, and particularly relative to the Pacific region, which is what I'm going to talk about, New Zealand came through this first extinction event relatively unscathed compared to other Pacific islands. And that meant that we, in a sense, inherited a larger biota of vulnerable bird species that are then now being impacted by European effects. And that explains why we're an outlier in this graph. On other islands throughout the Pacific, the very vulnerable species that would currently be threatened by these processes have already gone extinct. They've disappeared. And that's a large part of the reason why New Zealand sits where it does on that curve. So what I want to do now really is, I guess, just run through a bit of the background and evidence to sort of lead up to that idea, see what you think about it. I only thought of this the other day, so I'll be interested in your feedback and what you think, and what else we might need to do to try to understand why we've got to where we are. All right, and then just to frame this in a much broader context, New Zealand is really just a model ecosystem for what goes on in the rest of the world, and it's a really unique model ecosystem, as we'll see, because things happen so recently here, and we have such a good understanding of what went on. But this stuff happened all over the world. So we know us, Homo sapiens, we evolved in Africa, and 70 or so thousand years ago we moved out of Africa and we colonised other continental parts of the world. And so Australia was colonised very early on, 50,000 years ago or so. The Americas during the last ice age when land bridge opened up, and by about 13,000 years ago people had colonised pretty much all of the continental regions of the earth. And we know that as people moved out through the continental regions, human arrival was accompanied by major extinction events, and predominantly in large-bodied animals, and in continental regions that's best exemplified by mammalian extinctions. And so these are the numbers of genera that went extinct in these areas, not species, genera that went extinct. So 15 out of 16 genera greater than 40 kilograms in weight in Australia disappeared following first human arrival, and that pattern is replicated throughout the world. So almost certainly then first human arrival is accompanied by a major wave of extinction, in large part, due to things such as habitat alteration, changing fire regimes and so forth, but almost certainly because we are really good predators and we hunt animals, and the extinction of large-bodied animals largely tracks that. All right, so 13,000 years ago we had colonised most of the continental regions of the Earth. There's one vast region of Earth that remained uncolonised up until very, very recently, and that's the remote islands of the Pacific, simply because they're so inaccessible. So we know that by 30,000 years ago, people occupied, they occupied Australia much earlier than that, but by around 30,000 years ago, people occupied New Guinea and the outlying islands around that region. not much changed for a long period of time until around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, people started moving out into the Pacific, most likely from populations that originated from further north in Asia. They came down the coast and then moved out into the nearshore islands in the Pacific. By about 3,000 years ago, people had managed to get out as far as around about Fiji. And then there was a pause. People stopped for probably a couple of thousand years. And then there was another wave of movement as people moved further east out into Polynesia and out into the region of the Cook Islands there. There was another brief pause, perhaps for a couple of hundred years. And then all of a sudden, in this remarkable sort of wave of movement, people moved out and colonised the really far-flung reaches of the Pacific. So we got as far east as Rapa Nui, Easter Island, as far north as Hawaii. And then only about 750 years ago, people reached Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so New Zealand was the last major habitable landmass on Earth to be colonised by people. And so this event, this migration of people out in the Pacific, occurred relatively quickly, but extremely recently, and New Zealand the most recently of all. And that really does put us in a unique situation, because what we've got is because it happened so recently, we've got a record of what went on. And that record is preserved largely for our avifauna in terms of bones preserved in natural deposits like caves and sand dunes, but also in archaeological middens that tell us what people hunted and ate when they first got here. And we've got an extremely good record of bone preservation. There's vast numbers of bones present in the New Zealand landscape that have been classified, studied and looked at. And what it means is that we are, I think, the only place in the world where it's possible to completely reconstruct what our avifauna looked like prior to human arrival with really good certainty. We know really well what was here before people got here, and now we know really well what happened after people arrived and what disappeared, and of course we know pretty well what's happened since Europeans have arrived. And so we've got this opportunity to really understand what the processes are that drive extinction on islands after human arrival, and to get a bit of context to think about how we got to where we are. Right, as I just talk a little bit about, we can get essentially a complete reconstruction of what our avifauna looked like. And New Zealand, of course, was a world of birds. We were dominated by birds. We'll just run through a little bit about what we know about what happened in New Zealand, because it's such a unique case study. It gives us an opportunity to understand here and then to think about how what we find in New Zealand might apply to other places and interpret what went on elsewhere. So I'll just run through a little bit about what we know about New Zealand. We know that on the three main islands of New Zealand, so North, South Stewart Island, there were 131 bird species breeding on those islands before first human arrival. And shortly after first human arrival, we know that 40 of those species went extinct. So that's about 30% of the avifauna disappeared following first human arrival. So it's a significant extinction event. And of course, in terms of that filter I'm thinking about, we lost a whole subset of species that are now no longer present in our avifauna. And what was left was a selected group of species. And so the species that went extinct were a very biased subset of the avifauna. So we know that the things that disappeared tended to be large-bodied species, they tended to be flightless, and they tended to be our more highly endemic birds. So species endemic at the order and family level were more susceptible to extinction than those endemic at, say, the genus or the species level. So among the birds that went extinct during this event, of those that went extinct, 3/4 of those were flightless birds, and of those that survived, only about a bit over 10% of those were flightless. So there was a strong selection towards flightless birds, and they tended to be the big-bodied species as well. So on average, the body mass of extinct species greatly exceeded that of those that survived. That's a log scale on there. And it's not just the obvious things that we think about, like moa, that disappeared, a whole range of other kinds of birds. The adsbill, the strange ground-dwelling predator that no one's really quite sure what it's closely related to. This New Zealand goose that disappeared. So a whole quite diverse range of taxa disappeared during this extinction event. The other thing we know is it happened really quickly. So people turn up on an island and they're able to eradicate species off that island within a few hundred years. So the latest evidence we got from moa, work done by George Perry and others at Auckland University, using radiocarbon datings to look at the time of human arrival, sometime in the middle of the 13th century. The current dates are for when people arrived in New Zealand, and these represent the last dates of known moa egg and bone, so the last surviving moa. And these distributions give us an idea of the sort of uncertainties around those dates, but still they're pretty tight, and they tell us people arrived sometime in this period here, and within at least 200 years, large-bodied moa were all extinct, and within just a short time after that, the smaller-bodied moa had disappeared as well. Almost certainly this would have been a fairly small human population. And you think of New Zealand as a fairly large land area, a very small human population was able to eradicate several species, a dozen or so species of moa off quite a large land area in a very short period of time, a couple, 100 years. And so things happen really quickly. People have big impacts very, very early on. And of course, it wasn't just entirely human-induced extinction. So, I mean, the major drive, we think we understand the major drivers of this extinction. Habitat loss would have played a role. So clearing of dry eastern forests throughout the south and parts of the North Island of New Zealand. But almost certainly as hunting by people, that's probably the major cause of that extinction. Not only that, though, of course, there are cascading effects. So the loss of, or extinction of moa almost certainly would have resulted in the extinction of its major predator, the Harpagornis eagle. So there obviously would have been cascading effects of these extinctions into other species as well. All right, so as I mentioned, New Zealand's unique in providing us this window into quite some detail about what happens when people first turn up in a place and what the subsequent changes to the biota are. And what I want to do now, again, is step back a bit and just put this in a bit more of a regional context and try to understand a bit more about perhaps what went on in the rest of the Pacific as people moved across this landscape and look at the kind of outcomes on islands throughout the Pacific. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some information on fossil collections that are available from 41 islands throughout the Pacific. And this is pretty much the only data we have. These are the islands that have been studied and where bird remains have been found and catalogued and documented. And I'm really drawing on the work of David Steadman here, this guy who's done a lot of work throughout the Pacific and has compiled this remarkable book which puts together pretty much all of what we know about what went on Pacific Islands in terms of paleoarchaeology and paleoecology. So I'm essentially going to use the data out of David's book along with some additional stuff that colleagues and things I've worked on, but try to pull together all the information we've got about what went on these islands. And the reason why we haven't done this before, and I think people have really tried to do this sort of thing before, is it becomes a bit problematic because New Zealand's unique in having this vast collection of birds, well studied, lots of preservation sites, and we get a really good idea of what's going on in New Zealand. And the difficulty is across these other Pacific islands is that our collections and the availability of specimens is much, much more limited. So this is a distribution just showing the number of islands that have got different numbers of bones collected off them, fossil bird bones. And so, you can see a good chunk, most islands have got fewer than 1,000 bones collected on them. And there's a few well-studied islands, and New Zealand's off the graph here. We've got heaps and heaps of bones there. So the problem is that collection effort is sparse on most islands, and that means there's going to be big gaps in our knowledge of what was actually there. We're going to be missing a whole lot of stuff on islands, and I just want to illustrate what that means, and also how we can sort of get around that problem a little bit, and actually use what data we have to understand what's happening. And so here's an example from the island of Aotearoa that's been studied by David Steadman. He's done collection efforts on there. It's just off Fiji in the Lau group. We know on this island that there are 16 bird species that have been found in the modern record. So we know they're on the island, they've been recognised by European scientists, catalogued. So we know there's 16 species on that island. And then when David did his collection work, he's found 74 fossil bones on those islands of 13 species. And of the species that is identified in the fossil record, 6 of those species are also species that are on the island and have been on the island for a long time. So in other words, of the 16 species on the island, 6 of them have deposited their bones, and those bones are present in the fossil record. So what this gives us is a sort of an idea of what the detection probability is on this island. There's 16 species, 6 are recorded in the fossil record, so about 40% of birds on this island are available, if you like, in the fossil record and have been detected in that record. So it tells us something about our detection probability and then potentially about what we're missing. So the other 7 species on that island are species that aren't in the modern record. So they're prehistorically extinct birds. They were there, they're in the fossil record, but they're not there anymore. And then the fact that we've got about a 40% chance of detecting species in the modern record would suggest that we must be missing a good chunk of species in this prehistoric record as well. And the trick is that we can use information like this about what we know is there and what we find in the fossil record to, in a sense, calibrate and estimate how many species might be missing out of the fossil record. So despite the fact that there are going to be gaps in this fossil record, we can take advantage of this kind of information to build up a picture of actually what went on by estimating what might be missing and getting a much better feel for what went on across these islands. And that's what we did in some recent work. We used all of the fossil records for non-perching land birds, so these are the non-passerine, the larger species, and these are the things most likely to be impacted by first human arrival, and they're also the things that are better preserved in the fossil record because they tend to be bigger birds with bigger bone preservation. We used all of the information across those 41 islands, and we essentially reconstructed what went on using those kinds of methods that I talked about just before to try to use these detection probabilities to infer what went on. And so what I want to do is I just want to talk through some of the results of what we found out of here, and then I want to stitch New Zealand back into the story and think about how New Zealand fits in this context. So this is just going to be about the Pacific Islands now. One of the things we were able to do was not only did we look across those 41 islands, but we took the information from those 41 islands and we sort of expanded it out across the Pacific to try to come up with an estimate of how many birds in total were driven extinct during this event across all of the Pacific Islands. And this is our estimate of these large-bodied non-passerine land birds. This is our estimate of the number that went extinct across all of the Pacific Islands during that extinction event. And it's close to 1,000 species of bird. Now, I just want to put that in a little bit of context. Since 1500 AD, we've recorded 158 bird species that have gone extinct in our current extinction crisis. Right? We're estimating that about 1,000 bird species went extinct within the last few thousand years across these Pacific Islands. And BirdLife International recognise that there's currently about 11,000 bird species in the global avifauna. So this represents close to 10% of bird species going extinct within the last few thousand years in one major, effectively mass extinction across this major region. So almost certainly this is the biggest extinction event that's occurred certainly in the Holocene since the last ice age. So it's a massive loss of global bird biodiversity occurred as people moved out across this region, almost certainly. The second thing we can infer from the fossil record is that the pattern of extinction was pretty much the same as what we saw in New Zealand, that the kinds of species that went extinct were exactly the kinds of species in New Zealand, large-bodied and flightless species. And the key thing I just want to focus on here at the end there then is the variation in extinction rate across these 41 islands across the Pacific. So on average, the extinction rate was about 70%. But there was huge variation. Some islands, the extinction rate was as high as 90%, some down as low as 10%. And this is key really to understanding what's going on. Why does extinction rate differ so greatly? And there's two reasons. One is island area. Big islands tend to have lower rates of extinction than smaller islands. And almost certainly that's because large islands also tend to be taller and more rugged and preserve larger areas of habitat that most likely provide refuges for birds, both as places to live, but also protection from hunting and from people being able to get in there and remove them. And I guess the takahe is a really good example of that in New Zealand, presumed extinct, rediscovered in 1948, but rediscovered in this extremely remote valley in Fiordland. And almost certainly its survival was a consequence of its ability to persist in an extremely remote area inaccessible to people and likely slow for predators to colonise. Now, the taki would not have survived on smaller islands. It didn't have that kind of remote, rugged refuge for it to make it. The second thing when we look across the islands is that higher rainfall islands tended to have lower rates of extinction as well. And again, the reason is very similar as to what we see for island area. I suspect that if we look at the large island of Hawaii, for example, you have the trade winds that result in this very wet side of the island here and a very dry side of the island here. And that results in large areas of forest that are difficult to remove and that will regenerate relatively quickly. So maintenance of habitat. And today on the large island Hawaii, all of the native birds are confined to upper slope remnants on these volcanoes where native forests persisted. And most likely, again, that's an explanation for the ability of these species to survive. All right, so this is what we think went on across these 41 islands in the Pacific. I just want to put New Zealand in the picture now. If we add in a sense, our rainfall, and these are maximum, these are sort of the areas with highest rainfall on North and South Island, and the area of North and South Island, you can see that we fit reasonably comfortably within the same pattern that we see across these Pacific islands. Here we know the actual rates of extinction of non-passerine land birds in New Zealand. It's around about 25% on both islands. And you can see that we fall down this end here, consistent with what we see across the rest of the Pacific, and that these large, geographically rugged, high rainfall islands have much lower rates of extinction than these smaller, drier islands. And so I suggest that to a large extent explains why we are the way we are. That what's happened in New Zealand is that we have more species that have survived as a consequence of our geography and our rugged and remote terrain. That means that in some sense we've inherited a greater number of vulnerable species that went extinct on many of the other Pacific islands that suffered extinction rates that averaged around 70%. And so our current rates of threat and extinction in the New Zealand biota result from the fact that we, fortunately, inherited a large number of these species that persisted, but that are now vulnerable to the current set of threats that are much more pervasive, things like introduced predators, than what they've had to cope for during that first extinction event. Yeah, that's what I meant to say, and that's why New Zealand sits out there. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Time for one quick question.
Not so much a question. I guess you've shown the association between people arriving in extinction.
Yeah.
That doesn't tell us about the process. So the period Aotearoa, for example, tried to examine hunting as a possible process for extinction of many birds. Unfortunately, we missed the relationship with the estimated population size of strong. It's been indirectly published. So that whole process will have to be revisited. If in fact the process was curing, then that threatening process has been threatened all the time, and it sort of throws a slight spanner in the work of the
So we've done some work here looking at comparing. So, for example, what we did in one study was we were able to compare the availability of birds that were deposited in sand dune deposits versus their availability in archaeological middens, and to demonstrate that what was in middens, what was hunted and eaten by people, were a non-random subset of what was available. They tended to be the large-bodied flightless birds, and that those birds were in turn disproportionately more likely to go extinct from those areas as well. Now, it's obviously difficult to demonstrate, a causal link so far back in time, but there's pretty good evidence that what people hunted, that people selected a subset of the biota to hunt and eat, and that subset of the biota were predominantly those species that also ended up going extinct. So, I think there's a bit more evidence around the hunting process that's out there.
Thank you, Richard.
All right.